What and when was the golden age of Islamic science?
Somewhere between the 9th and 13th century AD, and this coincides with what we identify as early Middle Ages in Europe, also known as the Dark Ages. If you look at the stars, the overwhelming majority of them have Arabic names because they were named and described by Muslim astronomers. Al-Khwarizmi, who is one of the earliest ones, a great mathematician who created the new mathematical order based on 10. This allowed the introduction of zero that Muslims adopted from India, allowed us to think about negative numbers. This new system of notation allowed the development of algebra that was invented by al-Khwarizmi. Also, he created algorithm that basically is a corruption of his name, al-Khwarizmi.
While science was flourishing, blossoming, and being collected in the Islamic world, what was happening in Europe?
Not much in terms of intellectual productivity, scientific innovation, philosophical, theological, new thinking. Nothing was going on in Europe. That is why it's called the Dark Ages.
I heard the story that all this wonderful translation and discovery in mathematics was happening at a time when Charlemagne, King of France, first king of the Holy Roman Empire, was just beginning to learn to write his own name.
And Charlemagne very famously tried to create a library collecting all the books from all over Europe. His library could contain no more than 450 books. And most of these books were hagiographies, lives of the saints and things like that. And this is the time when Baghdad was teeming with bookstores, with thousands of bookstores. And in each of them, there were thousands of texts available from China, from India, Greece. It was a cauldron of all of these ideas that was creating this ionized environment for new thinking.
How was it that Baghdad became the center of scientific everything?
Probably it had something to do with the Abbasid dynasty coming to power about 100 years after the dawn of Islam, and the great suppression of philosophy and sciences in the Christian world, because they were identified as the pagan science and pagan thinking. Universities were closed, schools of medicine were closed by Byzantine emperors, and many of these scientists and many of these thinkers started coming towards the non-Christian world. Before the dawn of Islam, many of them came to Iran, and Iranian universities really benefited from that. The Jondi Shahpur University in southwestern Iran was created partly by these emigres. Many of these works of science and mathematics and astronomy and philosophy were translated in a very active endeavor by the Abbasid Caliphs in Baghdad, and so these were translated from Greek to Syriac and from Syriac into Arabic.
The Caliphate was pretty well known for not caring what your religion was. That the Jewish scholars and the Catholic scholars were not just welcomed in Baghdad, but begged to come.
There was a great deal of tolerance, and part of this enlightenment was examining the relationship between revelation and reason. So God has given us reason, God has also given us revelation. Which one should take precedence?
Mind blown, very shocked and delighted to see that the Muslims did so well for a couple of centuries. And then came Muhammad ibn al-Ghazali, who ruined the whole thing by declaring that mathematics was the work of the devil, right?
Wrong.
Neil De Grasse Tyson, in several speeches that I've seen online that I will put a link to below, said that the golden age of Islamic science ended with Muhammad ibn al-Ghazali, who declared that mathematics was the work of the devil.
These ideas, once they are spouted by a bunch of scientists and intellectuals and philosophers, there are other scientists and intellectuals and philosophers who come and say, this is bunk and this is the wrong way. This happened in Europe. In Europe, when the counter-enlightenment happened, its political consequences was fascism, was romantic nationalism. It didn't happen with one person. There were a bunch of people who were working on the counter-enlightenment side, rejecting logic, rejecting Greek philosophy, and arguing for the primacy of revelation over reason. These people, by the way, were not country bumpkins. They were themselves accomplished philosophers, but they rejected philosophy. Anti-intellectualism always is an intellectual product. People who oppose intellectuals are always themselves intellectuals. Al-Ghazali has written great philosophical works. He wrote a book against Plato, but before he wrote the book against Plato, he said, I have to first explain what Plato is saying. And he wrote such a wonderful book about Plato that it became a classic in Platonic studies. People who wanted to know Plato, they would have to read the book that he wrote in order to attack it. He didn't attack a straw man. So Al-Ghazali was a great philosopher, but who belonged basically to what I call the Islamic counter-enlightenment. That is one point. And another point is this end of Islamic Renaissance cannot be explained by an idea. When these movements come to existence and when they end, there are social, economic, political situations that contribute to this. It's not one person's word that has this kind of power to end a whole era.
The Mongols had a bit to do with ending the golden age of Islamic science.
Indeed, they did. When Mongols came, it wasn't only the trauma of Mongol invasion, of which we all have heard, the horrific massacres and destruction of the infrastructure and ruthlessness, but also Baghdad and Khorasan was devastated. And these definitely had something to do with the end of enlightenment in the Islamic world.
One of the things that shocks me about this story is that knowledge can be lost from a civilization.
5th century Greek enlightenment completely vanished to the point that Europeans didn't remember it until Renaissance, when it was rediscovered, partly because of the Muslim translations that came back to Europe through Andalusia. So, yes, science can very well be forgotten, and this is what happens all the time.
Some of our sciencey pals would say that we are perhaps in the modern equivalent of the 13th century of Islamic science, that the rise of religiosity represents a threat to the science that we have all taken for granted since the moon landing.
I don't really think that this fundamentalism, rise of fundamentalism, not only in Europe, in the Jewish and Christian civilizations, but also in the Islamic civilization and in the Hindu and even Buddhist civilization. I don't think these spell the end of this enlightenment. I think it's kind of a backlash, but the sobering thought should stay with us that nothing is irreversible, and we should be jealously and very assiduously defending the legacy of the European Enlightenment, because the European Enlightenment can also go away the way Islamic Enlightenment was eclipsed.
You don't mention the United States in that list of places where you see...
I think the United States is part of the Christian civilization, a very, very deeply Protestant creation from the beginning, and it is part of this world. And with the last quarter of the 20th century, exactly at the same time that the Iranian Revolution happened, 1978 is when the moral majority declares its existence. Same time in Israel, same time in the United States, there is a kind of retaking of the public square by the fundamentalists. We are witnessing a backlash that we should take seriously. We definitely should not dismiss it. But it is not the beginning of the end. In my view, the dark age is not inevitable. We can definitely fight it back.
Well, that's a nice, sciencey, and optimistic way to end it. Thank you so much, dear brother. Ahmad Sadri is professor of Islamic World Studies at Lake Forest College and my dear buddy. Thanks so much, Ahmad.
It was a pleasure as always.